Hi, everyone. We will get started in just a moment. We are waiting for everybody to enter into the webinar. Welcome. Hi, everybody. We will get started in just a moment. We are waiting for all our folks to get in from the waiting room. All right, we'll get started in just a few minutes, a few seconds, really, once we get all our folks in.
I see it's being live streamed on Facebook. What's the Facebook page?
The Kalmanovitz Initiative for Labor and the Working Poor at Georgetown.
Cool.
Let's get started. Welcome, everybody. I'm Lane Wyndham, the Associate Director of the Kalmanovitz Initiative for Labor and the Working Poor at Georgetown, and we are pleased to partner with the Solidarity Center to launch this important new book, Stopping Gender-Based Violence and Harassment at Work, the Campaign for an ILO Convention. As Jane noted, we are recording and we are also live on Facebook, and we will make the recording available to everybody who signed up for the webinar and also on our website after the event. Hey, we want to know who's here. I want to encourage our participants to tell the group who you are. Put your name, your geographic location, if you'd like, your organization into the chat so we can see who's with us today. Our format for today's meeting will be a roundtable discussion with our panelists. Our moderator, Shauna Bader-Blau, the Executive Director of the Solidarity Center, will begin the discussion by posing some questions to each panelist, and then we'll address all the audience questions at the end. You can submit those at any time through the chat and the Q&A function. We're going to post the links for how to get the book multiple times throughout this webinar. We'll get it posted up now, but we'll continue to post it. So don't worry if you miss it and all the chatter that's happening right now. Today's webinar grew in part out of nominations submitted in our New Social Compact project. The Kalmanovitz Initiative at Georgetown began this project in 2020, asking what world do we want to create in the pandemic's wake. The project envisions, defines, and lays the groundwork for a new social contract that centers working people and is based on equity. A world free of gender-based violence and harassment at work is absolutely a key component of a new social compact. We're going to have a major virtual convening on our new social compact project called the Pandemic Worker Wave and a New Social Compact. Stay tuned for registration on that. And we'll post in the chat some information on how to learn more about that. Thanks to both Shauna Bader-Blau and Kathy Feingold for serving on that project's advisory committee. So now I want to introduce our esteemed moderator for today's discussion. I'm thrilled to have Shauna Bader-Blau, who leads the Solidarity Center, the largest global worker rights organization based in the United States. Since October of 2011, she has served as executive director of this organization of more than 280 staff in Washington, D.C., some 30 field offices, implementing programs in 60 countries. And she's been with the organization for 19 years, and we're just thrilled to have her moderating our discussion today. So now I'm going to turn it over to Shauna.
Well, thank you so much, Lane, and thanks to the Kalmanovitz Initiative for jointly hosting this event with us. As we get started on this wonderful book launch event, I wanted to make sure everyone sees what it looks like, this fantastic book that you'll be hearing about how you can order, Stopping Gender-Based Violence and Harassment at Work, the Campaign for an ILO Convention. We're so excited to have co-authors, two of the three authors of this book with us today, and you'll be hearing from them shortly. This book is a wonderful read. It's educational, but it also teaches us a lot about how we can build a better economy, more fairness, more equity, more justice for workers and for women and for all people who deserve to work free from violence and harassment at work and in more just and equal societies. And the book is really an incredible story of organizing that really, I can't encourage you enough to get a hold of it. So I'm excited about this conversation. Let me start by introducing our panelists. Jane Pillinger. Jane is an independent researcher and a former visiting professor in gender studies at the London School of Economics and a senior research fellow in the Department of Social Policy and Criminology at the Open University in the UK and a co-author of the book. Robin Runge is an independent consultant on gender and labor and employment law and an associate professorial lecturer in law at the George Washington University Law School. Most recently, she was my colleague at the Solidarity Center, the co-director of the Equality and Inclusion Department with the Solidarity Center. Kathy Feingold is the director of the International Department at the AFL-CIO and deputy president of the International Trade Union Confederation, the organization representing 200 million unionized workers worldwide. She brings more than 20 years of experience in trade and global economic policy and worker and human rights advocacy and women's rights. And my sister, Rose Amamo. Rose worked for nearly 30 years on a car and bus assembly line in Mombasa, Kenya, and became the first woman general secretary of the Amalgamated Union of Kenyan Metal Workers in 2016. She is the treasurer of National Industrial Council of Kenya. Rose is also an executive board member of the Central Organization of Trade Unions in Kenya, COTUKE. Rose is an elected member of the Organization of African Trade Union Unity, OATU, the Women's Commission, in charge of information. And she's also an elected International Trade Union Confederation Africa Women's Committee representative. So welcome to our panelists who are with us. I'd also now like to introduce someone who is joining us by video, our colleague and sister, Manuela Tomai. Manuela Tomai is the director of the Work Equality Department at the ILO. Ms. Tomai was the lead coordinator of the preparatory work that culminated in the adoption of the last two ILO conventions, namely the one we're going to talk about today, Convention C-190 on violence and harassment in the world of work, and prior to that, C-189 on decent work for domestic workers, which was adopted in 2011. And with that, I'd like to turn it over to Manuela, and Lily will share the video with us from Georgetown.
Greetings from Geneva. Thank you for the opportunity to say a few words about the new book, Stopping Gender-Based Violence and Harassment at Work, which is being presented today. Why should you read this book? There are at least 3 reasons. It deals with Convention 190 on violence and harassment in the world of work, the first international treaty to deal with this scourge, and the last convention adopted by the International Labour Organization, showing its continued relevance to contemporary world of work issues. It explains the long and challenging process that culminated with the adoption of Convention 190 and its recommendation through the perspective and voice of women's union leaders who played an active role in this historic process. And it is a source of inspiration for all those women union leaders who want to make the workplace a better place to be. Let me highlight from the ILO's perspective a few factors that contributed to the adoption of these new ILO standards. No doubt, the external environment played a significant role. While discussions within the ILO's governing body regarding the need and desirability of new standards began long before the outbreak of the Me Too movement, the latter lent the negotiation of these standards further impetus and legitimacy. The mobilization within and beyond ILO's constituents in support of the new standards was remarkable. These standards speak to a large audience. Everyone has experienced or witnessed mistreatment and disrespectful behavior at work. Trade unions advocacy, mobilization, and coalition building with other actors of civil society were also key. The women's union leaders placed on the table important issues, such as men and masculinity, and highlighted the OSH dimensions of work-related violence and harassment. There were internal factors too. A committed and feminist secretariat, which I'm proud to have been part of and led, and the innovations introduced during the second year of the conference's deliberation regarding how negotiations were conducted. The conference committee decided to deal first with the most divisive provisions of the draft convention, regardless of the order of appearance in the draft text, and treat them as a package. The agreement was that the latter would not be adopted until all parties could live with each of the package's articles. It was a risky operation, but it worked out. In looking ahead, we need to bear in mind that the adoption of Convention 190 was a key achievement, but not the end of the journey. Ratification and implementation is of the essence. Ratifications have been coming, but not fast enough. We need to accelerate the pace of ratification of Convention 190. This takes time and energy. The ratification and implementation campaigns launched globally and nationally by the labor movement immediately after the adoption of the convention, as documented in the book, are an essential step in this direction. Let me conclude with a provoking question. Convention 190 is often seen as a treaty on gender-based violence and harassment. It certainly is a gender-responsive standard. I would dare to say that it is a feminist standard, but it covers all forms of violence and harassment and is highly inclusive of all in the world of work. In moving forward, will this perception be a curse or a blessing? Thank you very much for your attention.
And thank you to Manuela and the International Labor Organization for the presentation and the great introduction by Manuela and the wonderful role of the ILO in helping redefine and support standards for a 21st century and beyond in the world of work. So now let's get started. And I definitely want to, again, remind folks about this book. And I know my colleague from Georgetown will be dropping links in the chat about where you can get it, how you can order it. Along with the discount you can use to get the books for an affordable price. So thank you in advance to Georgetown for doing that. So I want to start with our two authors who are with us today, Jane and Robin. And let me ask you, Jane, just to set it up for us, why did you write the book and what does it set out to do?
Mute.
There you go.
Hi, thanks so much, Shannon. Thank you so much to Shannon and Lane for organising this launch. We're really thrilled and delighted to be launching the book today. So why did we write the book? Well, I remember, when we were in the latter stages of the negotiations in 2019 at the ILC, the International Labour Conference in Geneva, and I remember at one stage bumping into Robin and I said, Robin, this is just remarkable what's happening here. We were just at the stage where we thought we were going to get the convention. It was just on the edge of the possibility after all those years of work. And I said to Robin, we need to document this. It's the most phenomenal international campaign, of the power of women workers' struggles actually to stop gender-based violence that I've ever seen in my lifetime of working on this issue for over 30 years. And we wanted to document this global campaign because, first of all, it's often the voices of the women who are disproportionately affected by gender-based violence who we don't hear about. And one of the things that was an essential part of this campaign was those women. The women who organised their campaigns at the national level, who worked hard and tirelessly to get their governments to vote for the convention during the negotiations, but also in addressing some of the key issues around building alliances with NGOs, building alliances with employers and with governments, really to get this convention adopted. And what we saw in the room when finally the convention was adopted was this huge celebration. And it was a celebration that reverberated right across the world. So We wanted to show, first of all, the power of women workers and how they had a significant impact on global policy making and on the negotiations for the convention. And as activists and feminists ourselves, we really wanted to bring out those intersectional, diverse voices that were so important in the campaign, and to ensure that that spoke for the women themselves. So in a way, what we try to do in the book is really to just, it's almost, hopefully will be looked at as an important case study of global policymaking and global influencing by women workers for a global human rights movement. And it also, one of the things we try to do in the book is to explore the gender dimensions of, gender power inequalities, of intersectionality, of collective action led by women disproportionately affected by gender-based violence, and the feminization of trade unions that came from this, and the role of feminist women's organizing around a feminist world of work was really, really inspirational, and we wanted to document that as well. And we look at the campaign, it started, many, many years before it became part of the ILO's agenda. In fact, it's predated the Me Too movement. But what we try to do in the book is really follow the process, the institutional process in the ILO with the campaign. So we look at all of those dimensions, right from the original decision by the governing body in 2015, right through to the meeting of experts in 2016, and through the negotiations in 2019. That ended in 2019, that led to the overwhelming adoption for this convention. So we follow it, we track it through, and then the latter part of the book looks at the campaign around the ratification and the implementation of the convention, and particularly how it's being used currently in workplace struggles, in workplace negotiations, collective bargaining, in global agreements right across the global supply chain, even where it hasn't been ratified. So I hope that sums up in a nutshell what we tried to do and why we wrote this book and why it was so important.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Jane. And you mentioned like early on about the sort of joy and inspiration of the process of building towards this convention and achieving it. And I remember those moments, and I feel it even now being with you all having this discussion. And Robin, you had the foresight and thought to think about really with Jane and our sister Chidi King, who also helped write this book, to document this campaign. So what are the main conclusions that you draw from your research in documenting the campaign for C-190?
Thank you, Shauna. And I just want to thank you and Kathy and Rose all for being here today, and to both the Solidarity Center and to Georgetown, and to Lane in particular for hosting today's event. So I think there are some really key points to uplift that I came away with after we completed the research and the writing of the book. The first is that I think it bursts some myths. There's this myth that women of color from the global South, domestic workers, agricultural workers, garment workers, they can't possibly do this. They can't possibly write and negotiate and form a global movement for a global labor standard. And what the campaign for Convention 190 shows us is that is false. That is, not only is it false, these are the folks who can do this most effectively. That we have in Convention 190 a reflection of the rights and needs of the workers who most need these protections. And they are teaching us. They are teaching us through this standard how to do this better. And when those individuals lead this process, what we see is a convention, a labor standard that covers not just employees, for example, all workers. Why, you ask? Because women, people of color, trans women and men, disabled workers are disproportionately not employees. Disproportionately, they're in the informal sector. They don't have contracts. And so if this was another labor standard written by mostly men, to be honest, it would have covered employees again, possibly, right? But that's a breakthrough right there, covering the entire world of work, where all places where work is performed. Again, these women taught all of us, right, about their experiences and bravely shared really difficult, graphic stories of gender-based violence and harassment, sexual violence, sexual harassment that they experience not once in a while, but every day, and why and how best to address them. So, I mean, I think that is, and as Jane said, we really hope that what we've documented here can be replicated, because this is really key. And then the second thing is that unions and women leading their unions are essential to really creating the culture change globally that we need to eradicate and prevent gender-based violence and harassment in the world of work. Only through collective action, right? And through the social dialogue was this possible. And then I think as we continue on and see the beginnings of implementation of this phenomenal global standard, again, it is essential that the women in unions lead this process, because they are teaching us about how do you do this, right? What does this look like on the ground? What are the interventions that we need? So I'm really hopeful that this will be replicated, right, around the world in different ways, and that we continue to follow the lead of these phenomenal women like our sister Rose, who's with us today.
Well, thank you so much, Robin. And you mentioned the role of the labor movement. Jane mentioned it, Manuela in her opening video, but let's put a finer point on this point. And I want to turn it to my sister, Kathy Feingold from the AFL-CIO, and just ask, clearly this was a worker-driven agenda. The idea for C-190 didn't come from the sky or from employers or from governments. It came from workers and from trade unions and trade union women leaders. So what do you think were some of the critically effective aspects of the union campaign that galvanized labor movements here? And why was C-190 anyway so important to the labor movement?
Thanks so much, Shauna. And it is so great. I'm looking at the chat. I feel like we are amongst sisterhood here. This is very exciting. I'm envisioning that we're all back in a room together. So great to be here today. I want to start by just reminding all of us, to your question, Shauna, that we already were building a foundation for many years before we got to this moment. And so I've been in the labor movement for over 20 years, and then working with the ITUC, the Global Labor Movement's Equality Department. And, we used to run campaigns on violence against women. And we had postcard campaigns. And I remember I'd go to my meetings and I'd come back to the United States with a stack of postcards. And then I'd get to my office and I'd be like, now what do I do? We're all against violence against women, right? You would talk to your colleagues in the labor movement and they would say, of course we would. And so the first thing that shifted in terms of what was an effective aspect of this campaign is that we started to shift our framework. We started to, we knew about violence against women, but suddenly we started talking about our stories, the fact that it was happening in our homes, on the buses we took to work, right? How many of us, someone uncomfortable, bumping up against us, and then of course our workplaces, from hotels to construction sites. So this no longer was a general conversation to put on a postcard, we oppose violence. It was about our lives and our experience. The second important thing that happened is we took that analysis about, wait a second, this is all of us, right? In every country of the world. And we have a kind of a shared analysis that this is happening. And then we said, but wait, there's something's missing about that from this postcard campaign. And that's a power analysis. And so we went from sort of a violence against women, we're against violence, to wait, this is about power. And that's something the labor movement understands really well. And so we took that analysis and we continued to build it, that it's about the power imbalance we face every day in our workplaces. We know that well, workers and employers, and the imbalance of power, and the imbalance of relationships in our society that led to this kind of violence. The other thing, so we could readily relate to this, and I think that was a big shift with that kind of framework. We also knew that there were other structural forms of discrimination in all of this. So as we were having these conversations, and Robin already outlined some of them, Whether it was you were in a job in the informal economy without the same protections in your workplace, or there were issues around race, LGBTQI, immigration status, indigenous, we started looking at the structural issues that we needed to change. So we have a new power analysis, analysis of the structural problems. And then for the labor movement had been talking for years about the problem in global supply chains, right? This economic model that was problematic. And it had gotten discussed in the Convention 189, which is part of our foundation around domestic work. But supply chains in and of itself, how they were organized, were leading to really the denigration of workers and many women workers. And one of the best examples I remember is taking an AFL-CIO delegation to Juarez, Mexico, to look at women working in the maquilas. Women were being killed. There was femicide going on. And it was as if it was like two different stories, right? Well, how great women are in the maquilas, and there's jobs for women, and women are taking buses home, and nobody knew they were just getting killed, as if this was just sort of these two different conversations. Again, the more we could have a power analysis, we could get back to saying, no, this is connected to the economic model. So I really think that was what shifted it. And so I think a couple things. One is this is about power. It's about gender. It's about an economic model. So we, for years at the ILO, we tried to get a standard around global supply chains that the employers have refused and continue to refuse. And I always kind of said, that this gender-based violence standard gets at the issues in the economic model, the precarious work. And so just to close, we really started organizing a campaign because we understood if you're going to have structural change and transformation, this isn't one by one us sending in a postcard. It's not us one by one calling into a hotline, although these are all important aspects and tools, but this is a new tool. This is about collective action. This is about standing up in our workplaces and saying we need to shift this imbalance of power. And so, it was the first time, I think, at the AFL-CIO, Robin wasn't even at that point. I think we invited you in as a professor. We said, we brought people into our union hall that had never been in a union hall before, I think there's people from CARE on the call, from Human Rights Watch, and we built out these intersectional coalitions, and we formed an organizing campaign to transform the lives of women and the economic model.
Really powerful and such a good insight, like the issue of power and how getting a convention like this helps address some power dynamics that are behind the violence and harassment in the world of work, in our supply chains, and in the economic model that we're organizing to upend and improve through worker activism around the world. So let me turn it over to my sister, Rose. Rosa Mamo, like you were a leader in the actual negotiations in Geneva and on the continent of Africa at a regional level, at a global level, and also in Kenya as well. But you were a leader in negotiating around this convention itself in Geneva. And just like, could you say a little bit about that process and what that was like? And then we'd also love to hear a bunch of other stuff about Kenya too, but maybe we could start with the role you had and what it was like negotiating this convention in real time in Geneva.
Thank you, Shona, for giving me this opportunity to share. Actually, I don't know where to start, but let me say that it was the most interesting process that we had in Geneva, because I was leading the campaigns for the African countries and African governments, talking to the African governments together with my African sisters that we were working together with, and making sure that we are also linking them to other governments to make sure that as we lobby them to support us in this campaign, we also influence them to lobby other governments to support us in this campaign. And it was amazing. Like people were thirsty for this campaign. Sisters and brothers that were workers really wanted this campaign and wanted to campaign for this convention because, one, we wanted a convention supplemented by a recommendation. Two, we wanted this convention because it is so comprehensive And we were looking at our national laws, and everybody was saying we do not have a comprehensive labor standard like this one, or even our national laws. And so we had a role and a responsibility to truly campaign, lobby, and make sure that this convention is adopted. And when we were in Geneva, being in the bureau, and also making sure that I reach out to all African governments, and sisters from all over the world were united. They were speaking in one voice. We need a convention supplemented by a recommendation. And everybody took it upon herself to lobby their governments, to lobby their employers. Although it was very difficult with the employers, because they did not want a convention in the first place. They wanted a recommendation. But then we were to really give real case studies, say how violence and harassment has affected women globally. You know, try to convince them that this is a good convention, that if we lobby for its adoption, then we can be certain that there is something that can be done. Again, it was so interesting because we had our lawyers with us, like Robbie. She was there to make sure that when we are hungry, she could go and get some chocolate for us, get something for us, make sure that we have the energy to lobby, to share, and to make sure that we are pushing and pushing. But also there were times that we were with the language. How do we go about this language? Is it fine? Is it not fine? Then Robin, can you construct it for us? And you know, it was just women of the world united for a common goal, which is adoption of Convention 190 and its recommendation 206. And in that process, really, it really needed a lot of commitment and sacrifice. I remember one day I just got out of Kenya and went all the way to Uganda, to Kampala, to meet the African spokesperson then, to just tell him, sir, we are with you. We want your support. Speak boldly for this convention. And indeed, they did. So it was a wonderful moment, very beautiful, you know, women coming together, campaigning, lobbying. We could not sleep. We were leaving the center sometimes at midnight and go to our rooms. We didn't bother whether we would get food or not, whether the cafeteria is closed. We were like, what we want is this convention. And so it was wonderful. Now we are happy that there are a few countries that have ratified this convention. Kenya has not yet ratified the convention, and we have been talking with the government for the ratification of this convention. And the last meeting we had with the government, and if you can remember, His Excellency, the President of the Republic of Kenya, Uhuru Kenyatta, in his presidential address, committed to ratification of this convention. But we have a feeling that it is taking too long, you know, and we have been trying to do all that it takes. We developed with Solidarity Center in Kenya an advocacy strategy that we are using to lobby the government to ratify this convention, which is in place and which I can share with all of you maybe after this. And we are lobbying the government. Recently, last week, we had a meeting with the presidential aspirant, whom we are also supporting his candidature. And we put it very clearly to him that when he takes over the leadership, if he will take, then he needs to put into his agenda first ratification of this convention. And His Honorable Raila Odinga stood up and said, we will ratify this convention. I said, we will, it's not compulsory. Can you just say, we shall? And he said, we shall. So we are certain that they will ratify. We are trying to look through the labor board, look into the tools that we need to put down for ratification of this convention. And we are certain that Kenya will ratify this convention. We have disseminated C-190. We have taken, you know, we have eliminated women and men. We have formed a gender champions committee in Kenya that is looking for ratification of this convention and that is looking at dispute handling. But Shona, let me tell you this. I know my time is done, but let me just share one thing, is that we are negotiating collective bargaining agreements, and we are now convincing all trade unions to borrow clauses from the articles of this convention to put into our collective bargaining agreements even before ratification, so that it can start working even through the recommendation 206. We borrow items to put into our collective bargaining agreements. I think it's necessary to share this. It was wonderful. Yes.
Thank you so much. And that really just bringing home what the experience was like in Geneva. And I would just lift up that the advocacy of the labor movements of the continent of Africa with their governments led to a very powerful pro-convention stance on the part of the African bloc within the ILO. And we really lift up that work of leaders like Rose, who made that happen at working with governments, and we lift up the role of Africa in supporting the ILO in these conventions as well. And so just thank you for that amazing work and story, and plus the chocolate, like feed the body and the soul thing. And I wanted to kind of stick where Rose left off, Robin, where talking about collective bargaining and trying to incorporate language from the convention into collective bargaining. You were part of you played a central role and a leadership role in something that later became known as the Lesotho agreement, which is the first global agreement that actually took C-190 and sort of institutionalized it. This is an agreement implemented in Lesotho, signed by international brands, a local supplier, unions, women's rights organizations in Lesotho to address violence and harassment in apparel factories there. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about this how this groundbreaking agreement implements C-190 in these workplaces.
Thank you, Shauna. And I have to say, Rose, it was a privilege of a lifetime to bring you chocolate at 10:30 at night on day 7 of negotiations. And I mean it sincerely. So yeah, I mean, I think what is so remarkable now, and I see one of our brothers from Lesotho is here. I want to give a shout out to my brother Sam from Naktu, who's here, to see how this worker-led process and worker-driven standard that reflects again the experiences of workers is on the ground now, affecting change and keeping all workers safe. Something that we have alluded to, but I really want to lift up is what the workers also helped us understand is that the abuses that we're talking about are broader than sexual harassment. They're inclusive of sexual harassment, but they're broader than sexual harassment. And so they actually, out of the box, said, well, yes, it's sexual harassment, but it's more than that. And it's not only women who experience this. Disproportionately women do, and women of color and immigrant women and migrant women, but not only women. And so when we started working in Lesotho, and I was privileged at the Solidarity Center to be a part of a team that came together with my brother Sam and our sisters in Lesotho and the manufacturer, the garment manufacturer, and 3 brands who really all came forward and saw that this continued to be a primary barrier to decent work for all workers in those I mean, I just can't say that strongly enough. Modeling, right, that social dialogue, right, coming together and saying, we need a solution, and having the manufacturer and the brand say, this needs to be worker-led. And so then turning to the unions and these women's rights organizations that for years had been as lawyers handling complaints on behalf of women experiencing a grievous, just unbelievable violence based on gender and sex. And so importantly, the language from Convention 190, and in particular, the definition of gender-based violence and harassment appears in the agreements that these parties all signed, in these binding legal agreements. And that's the first place that happened. And this actually was happening even before the convention was finalized, going back to, I think, some of the things that Rose was saying, right? Like the power of this process and the influence. And there are 3 key components to the program that is underway in Lesotho, led again by our union brothers and sisters and the women's rights organizations. The first is it created an independent entity apart from the manufacturer to handle concerns and complaints about episodes and incidents of gender-based violence and harassment. And this again came from the workers who said, we're just not in a trust space right now to use the internal systems at the manufacturer. And in fact, the manufacturer had tried repeatedly, and none of it had actually prevented and eliminated gender-based violence and harassment. So an independent entity has been created in Lesotho that is handling these complaints and is showing accountability and being transparent about that accountability, what happens, and so that workers see that their complaints are being taken seriously, that their safety is at the center of this, and that they will not be retaliated against for coming forward. The second thing it created is an independent confidential information line run by the women's organizations, one of the two women's organizations. And this is also critical. Confidential, trained counselors are taking calls from workers, not just complaints, but any kinds of concerns, right? Questions they may have about the program, about rights, about what happened. And they are referring some workers to support services and also letting some workers know that if they believe there's been a violation of these agreements and the code of conduct that was created through these agreements that prohibits gender-based violence and harassment, that they're referred to Workers' Rights Watch, the independent entity. And then the third piece is, and this is remarkable, and I need to lift this up, the manufacturer agreed to have every single worker in these different factories in Lesotho go through 2 days of in-person, peer-driven education and awareness programs run by the unions and the women's groups, not just talking about the new program and the code of conduct prohibiting gender-based violence and harassment, but more broadly about how did we get here? What is the social construction of gender? And what is gender-based violence and harassment? And having the workers' time paid for that, to recognize, and actually all of the workers, not the managers, all the way up, everyone is going through this education awareness program. And I think that's essential because what C190 recognizes is the need for culture change, right? Is that this isn't about building a better mousetrap in a complaint process. It's about shifting the culture and really communicating and bringing people together to solve this. And one thing I just want to lift up that is a centerpiece of Convention 190, it is actually included in the text and also is included in the agreements in Lesotho, is that we cannot eradicate and prevent gender-based violence and harassment in the world of work if we don't have collective bargaining and freedom of association. And so that is a centerpiece of the convention, and it is a centerpiece of these agreements so that workers are also reporting when their right to collectively bargain, right? Their right of freedom of association is being violated because these things are inextricably linked to shift that power dynamic. You know, any woman has been sexually harassed, and I have been at work, you know how difficult it is to do this alone. But with a union, with the collective power of the union, that's the way forward. So I was thrilled and honored and privileged to be a part of the Lesotho process. And I know my brother and sisters from the Solidarity Center and in Lesotho continue that great work.
Thank you. Great illustration of how C190 can look real for workers in real life through social dialogue and collective bargaining, and led amazingly by our great brothers and sisters in the labor movement of Lesotho. And I'm really proud that some of them are joining us today, including our brother Sam from NOCTU, a wonderful garment workers union. So thank you for that. And, you know, Jane, just pulling it back a little bit, yeah, as a researcher and someone who studies this like objectively, like sort of what's going on here, what is this convention, what's powerful about it? Like when you read the text and you have written this book and you think about it, what are some unique features of the convention itself that really like point to you like that women workers really drove it, not some other entity, not some multilateral random process, but women workers?
Yeah, thanks very much, Shanna. It's a really important question because, you know, one of the things we wanted to document was the fact that this was a unique, unprecedented global social movement led by women. That's not to say there weren't really key people from the ILO, within the ILO, from some governments, and indeed from some employers' organizations. But this was a movement led by women workers. There's no doubt about it. And, you know, as Rose put it so brilliantly, showed, you know, the importance of driving that agenda across Africa with the governments with huge success. And we, you know, always so admiring of Rose and all of those other women who were part of the negotiations for this convention. So what's unique about it? Well, I suppose the first thing to say about the convention, it was women workers who were advocating for a global human rights standard for all workers, for all workers. And this was about ending violence and harassment against all workers, but with a very strong focus on gender-based violence and harassment, because this is the predominant form of violence and harassment that takes place in the workplace. And I can't say enough how important it was to get this as a human rights standard. The fact that, the workers pushed constantly for this to be named as a human rights norm, that violence and harassment is something that is really, important as a violation and abuse of human rights. And the workers stuck hard with that. And in fact, I remember when that was finally agreed during the negotiations, and the women across the workers group, who were this colourful, large group of women workers, 200 plus, negotiating day and night for this. And there was this kind of ripple of relief going through the whole of the auditorium, this huge auditorium. And, everybody wanted to jump up and dance at this stage, but had to retain their excitement because there was so much else to negotiate. So getting it as a human rights principle was absolutely crucial. But if you read the convention, you'll read that there are references made to unequal power relations, to the importance of addressing discrimination from an intersectional perspective. And in fact, one of the really important breakthroughs that again the workers pushed for time and time again was to get domestic violence recognised as a world of work issue, that employers could have responsibilities around mitigation. I suppose the second aspect of it that Robin and everybody else has mentioned as well is that, this is about workers who are disproportionately affected by gender-based violence. And one of the things that's really breakthrough for the convention was to get informal workers named in the convention. It's the first time informal workers have been named as a group with rights in a convention. They've been named in recommendations, but not specifically in the convention. So that's really important. But also that the fact that it applied to workers regardless of their contractual status. It was relevant for workers who were in the recruitment process. And we know time and time again how sexual favours and demanding of sexual favours have been so much part of recruitment. So it protected women in all of those world of work settings, including, and I think so important during the pandemic, was its reference to integration of third-party violence and harassment into the overall definition of violence and harassment. We know third-party violence and harassment against retail workers, health workers, and so on grew during the pandemic. So that was really important to get that integrated into this, very comprehensive definition of violence and harassment, including things like travel to and from work, which, was again a really, really difficult issue to negotiate, but it's in the convention and recommendation. The third aspect of it that is really important is that it's very constructive about the obligations that national laws should codify and put into place on employers. For example, around workplace policies, around effective complaints procedures, around risk assessment, of bringing those issues into occupational safety and health, and addressing things like gender power relations as part of your risk assessment in the workplace. I mean, how transformational is that to have achieved in an ILO convention? And that's really important. But also that some of these issues of gender-based violence are also important psychosocial risk factors at work that need to be addressed. So not only does it, provide, this broad focus around violence and harassment for everybody, it also opens up possibilities for us to demand that employers and governments address unequal power relationships in the workplace. Mm-hmm. And it's a really, in my mind, a really important blueprint for governments, for employers, for unions. As Robin has said, the Lesotho Agreement was one of the first, groundbreaking legal agreements that uses the language of Convention 190. We had another similar agreement using the Lesotho model, agreed just recently, just last month, for H&M suppliers, H&M, the global brand, similar model of an agreement, a legal agreement with the unions, with the brands, with the suppliers, and so on. So, and I suppose, I know I'm going to run out of time in a minute, but my final thing to say actually is that this was a real triumph of social dialogue. of dialogue between governments, workers and employers, led by workers who were absolutely committed in this groundbreaking movement, actually, to persuade employers and governments about the need for this convention. And, I have admiration for all of the workers who were involved in those negotiations, but also across the world for many years who are campaigning for this to happen. It really is a triumph of social dialogue, particularly at this time of backlash against feminism, against workers, and against trade unions.
Well, thank you so much, Jane. And I would add against, democracy and the ability of people to shape their own futures. That's where I want to bring it back to Kathy. Before I do this, I want to remind everybody that this is the book, and you have actually a link there in the chat. It's called Stopping Gender-Based Violence and Harassment at Work, the Campaign for an ILO Convention. And look in the chat, you'll find it. Maybe my colleagues at Georgetown will drop it in again. I want to turn it over to Kathy again, and then we're going to hear from Rose. And I have one more question for each of them, and then we're going to turn it over to you. So I want to remind our folks that brothers and sisters and siblings and friends who are attending today that you can drop some questions in the Q&A feature here, and we'll try to get to those. So just briefly, Kathy, so bringing it back to this kind of standard setting, the AFL-CIO and the unions of the American labor movement and the global labor movement have always and are now pushing governments and employers and multinational corporations and international institutions of all kinds for a fairer, more just global economy that doesn't just work for the wealthy, but works for working people. And so I'm just wondering, like in the context of trade and investment, supply chains and your advocacy, how does C190 fit into like our fight for a more just future in that advocacy you do? And if I could ask you also as a fellow American labor movement leader, our government doesn't ratify any conventions and unlikely to in this case, but so then what's the point of doing advocacy in the US if we're not going to ratify them anyway? Maybe you could share a little bit about that.
Sure, there's a big point to it, but I'll get to that. So I think, the first thing is, this instrument came into our hands. It was a huge, as we've heard, a huge process at a time when we're experiencing this incredible rupture, right? For decades, the neoliberal economic model that, deregulated, privatized. We all went through a lot of the fights around structural adjustment and privatizing public services. I really think this convention is part of the pushback, is part of the vision for a different model. How it plays out in things like trade and investment policy, very concretely. For example, here in the United States, we now have a new framework called worker-centered trade policy. What exactly does that mean? It means you ask the question, how will this policy, for example, trade and investment policies, impact working people or impact the environment? We actually unpack that one step further. We say, well, what impact, for example, might that have on gender, on race? Just this past week in the United States, we held roundtable sessions with workers from across the country, looking at how trade impacts various communities. And that is, for the first time, we now have these new tools, these new frameworks. It's not that we're having to convince people. We did that at the global level already. Employers already heard this debate. So it's made it a lot easier. We have a trade benefit program here called the Generalized System of Preferences. And again, we're talking about how do you bring gender and discrimination into that so that it can be a tool for some of our siblings in other countries to use with their governments. So I think this framework, and it, for me, as somebody that does advocacy, it makes it a lot easier to say to the business community, who I'm always talking to about trade and investment policies, you already agreed to this at the global level. This is done. We're not rerunning this conversation. Been there, done that. And I think that gives some weight to being able to further a conversation about what's next, what's the economic model we're trying to build. Because as I have said in the past weeks, we are actually, making and flying the plane, right? We don't know what the new economic model is, but we know that gender equity, racial equity must be at the heart of it. So that's that question, Shauna. In terms of why do advocacy in a country like the United States, where we notoriously do not sign on, do not ratify. And I think even now with a very split Congress, it's even more challenging. I would say the exact same thing I said when Convention 189 on domestic work was passed in our country. If you look at the movements, the domestic worker movement in the United States, they took that framework, they made model, city level agreements. Again, they didn't have to like reinvent it. It was already done. It was already shaped. They said this has already been agreed to by governments and by employers. This is what we want to see in Philadelphia. This is what we want to see at the city level. On gender-based violence, we're doing the same thing. So we're focusing our campaign on implementation. We have a new White House National Action Plan on gender equity. Gender-based violence is right there, giving guidance to our agencies. I know we have some representatives from the agencies. This needs to be integrated. So even if we don't ratify it, it needs to be seen as a framework that gets implemented. The last example I would say is much like other countries around collective bargaining, we found that when we started looking at our collective bargaining agreements, that what had happened in a lot of instances is we had cut and pasted language from our own EEOC, the Equal Opportunities Organization Commission here in the United States. We really hadn't updated it. It was just kind of boilerplate language that had been cut and pasted. So I think this gender-based violence framework is also a really helpful tool for us to take and update that. So when we go to the bargaining table, we can say, this is the high bar. This is what we want to see in our agreements, not language from 1990 that hasn't been updated or hasn't come out of a process of activism and advocacy and women's lived experiences that kind of came out of a legalistic framework. That this is really, useful language. So I want to say to everyone listening from the United States or in countries, I know I've been seeing in the excitement of Albania and other countries, you go, sisters, where you are ratifying. But for those of us in countries where ratification may not be the best focus of our energy, I mean, we need to do both, talk about the importance of ratifying, but also how do you implement this in our workplaces, in our communities. And I also see that Unite Here's on the phone, which is our hotel workers, your hands off, pants on ordinance. They passed city ordinances, making it safe for hotel workers so that they have panic buttons, so they're not alone in hotel rooms. So excellent examples of how you can take a framework, inspire it into local ordinances, and have real concrete change.
Awesome. These are such practical examples of how to make this aspirational agreement real in the lives of real people. And that's actually in the very short amount of time we have before we get to questions. And let me remind everyone, you can drop questions in the Q&A. I want to just briefly, Rose, in Manuela's opening video, she from the ILO, she talks about how this convention, she says, it's one way we can see the ILO is still relevant to people's lives around the world. Just briefly, could you share what it means to Kenyan workers, to women workers and workers in Kenya, that this convention is real and that you're working to make it practical for the people of Kenya? What does it mean to people? How do they lift it up? How do they experience it?
Thank you, Shona. And as Manuela said, this ILO is real. The convention is real. It is also real to the people of Kenya, because I remember the first time, even before the trade unions started campaigning for ratification of this convention, it was discussed in the judiciary. That was the first point of reference in Kenya. And it became very clearly that this convention is very important for our country and for Kenyan workers at large. You can remember, Shona, that in Kenya, we have the Sexual Harassment Offense Act, we have the Gender-Based Violence Act, we have all sorts of acts and laws that talk to gender-based violence and harassment, but not comprehensive as ILO Convention 190. And so when this convention was adopted, for Kenyan workers, we have a convention that now speaks to our lives. And why did they say it speaks to their lives? They looked at the area of the apprentice being covered by this convention. They looked at the attaches being covered by this convention, job seekers, And they were like, these are the most people who are normally harassed. These are the most people who, when they are looking for jobs, they are turned left and right, asked for sexual advances. And nobody speaks at it because they are not recorded or recognized as workers. And so they said this convention has an elaborate definition for workers that has now covered this group, and especially the vulnerable group. And they were like, this is what we want. So ILO Convention to Kenya and Workers Convention number 190 is real. It is the convention that we say would make the test and would meet the test of time, and a convention that we are all looking for. And we have been wondering, why is the government not ratifying this convention when everybody else feels that this convention is key for us? So with the challenges that the government may have, and we as workers are saying that we have already these laws, if you need tools to put down for ratification of this convention, it is just bringing them together. And ratifying this convention, because for us as workers in Kenya, men and women, it is the convention that will stand the test of time for us. Yeah.
Shauna, you're muted.
Sorry. So I was saying that's a great point, Rose, about the convention that stands the test of time. I would like to now turn it, we have some questions, and I want to ask my labor movement sisters, Rose and Kathy, if either one of you want to take this first question, which is from Allison, and it says, when our labor movements participate in the campaign for C-190, do you believe this is an opportunity to shift our internal labor movement cultures, around violence and harassment and gender-based violence? So inside our own institutions. Kathy or Rose, would you like to take
yes,
that?
can I take over that, Shauna? Yes, I believe so, because one, let me tell you that our trade union organizations, also our workers experience gender-based violence and harassment at the workplace, forgetting that a trade union is a workplace like any other workplace. So we believe as trade unions and as labor movement that as we campaign for ratification of this convention, we know that we will support trade unions in eliminating gender-based violence and sexual harassment at the workplaces, and more so violence and harassment. And you will all agree with me, all participants that are here, that even in our own organizations, some of us, the leaders, are the perpetrators. We have had several cases of women being harassed in labor movement. So I believe that this is going to be an eye-opener for all labor movement organizations in the world to also promote a workplace that is free from violence and harassment, and that will not tolerate gender-based violence and harassment, including sexual harassment at the workplace. So this has come at the right time, when labor movement themselves can also use this international labor standard to shape its own organization, in reforming the organization and making sure that gender-based violence is not part of the job in any organization.
Kathy?
Couldn't agree more with Rose. And maybe just to give a perspective from the US, I think that we had the layering of the Me Too movement. And one thing I will say, what I really like about the book is it goes through how the Me Too movement was very uneven around the world. But in the US, the Me Too movement was taken up because we had some high profile cases. And I think that the coupling of the conversations around gender-based violence that were happening with the Me Too movement, these two things sort of gave wind to each other. Some really concrete impacts in the US labor movement included, we had a big gathering in February of the year of the Me Too movement where we really heard from women labor leaders about what Rose just articulated, that, for years, we've turned a blind eye to our own institutions, to the own imbalance of power, and that we needed to change. So one way we did that, we issued a report, which people can find online, but we also created a code of conduct that we read, so that there's no questions. Oh, we had no idea this wasn't appropriate behavior. And the code of conduct, extends to, the bars after a union meeting, which is where a lot of this behavior would occur. It was not just in the formal meeting where there could be, inappropriate behavior, but a lot of it was sort of that expanded work hour, right? Where you're in a meeting, a 2-day meeting, and everybody's going to eat or to have a drink, and a lot of inappropriate behavior would happen there. So our code extends to that. That has created conversation that is, we're not accepting. There is someone responsible in each meeting if something happens. So I think that sends a very strong message. And then again, it opened up conversations in all of our affiliates about, we don't have enough time here, but SAG-AFTRA, our stage, the film industry came up with their own program, changing the way that people go to do their own interviews, because you can imagine they go up into hotel rooms. So lots of concrete examples came out of both, I would say, the gender-based violence conversation that's been happening globally and nationally, and the Me Too movement, which in the US context, those two together had a really powerful impact on conversations within the labor movement.
Really powerful, Rose and Kathy, for concrete examples inside the labor movement of how we're making change and walking the walk. And just thank you for lifting that up. Got a couple more minutes. We've maybe 7-8 minutes. And there's a question from Perna that I want to address. I want to ask Robin to address, and it's basically around, we've seen in I'm summarizing here, in COVID, we've had an increase of violence and harassment, and not just domestic violence, but also in workplaces. And, what is C190 kind of like, how does C190 help us think about how handling reports and investigations into these issues should really be handled?
Thank you, Perna. It's great that you're here. And thank you, Shauna. So I think one of the most critical things that C190 clearly states is that workers have to be engaged in the process of designing any complaint mechanism, right? Because they will share, for example, workers through this process shared with me and with others, and Rose, you should speak up here, but that if the person you're supposed to complain to is your boss, and that's the person doing it to you, that's not going to work. If the person you're supposed to complain to is in some kind of a human resources thing, and it's not clear like what they're doing with the information you're giving them and who they're going to tell, and what the process is, like if they complain, what is there an investigation? What does that mean? Are you going to talk to this person who I work with who did this to me? And am I going to go to work that same day? I don't feel safe, right? So the other thing that workers have really highlighted for this is centering, not just focusing on penalties for the individual, right? But remedies for the individual who's experiencing this, and also recognizing that it's not enough to focus on punishment, and I'm putting that word in quotes, for the individual actor, but that it's structural, right? The convention recognizes that the employer has a responsibility and that they need to look at how work is organized to get at many of the themes we've talked about today. The power dynamics and the inequality. One of the most powerful things that a garment worker shared with me in Cambodia many years ago that I've shared is, a sewing machine, a woman who works on a sewing machine, and it's a sewing machine mechanic, right? Who's the one who's constantly sexually harassing her, groping her, requiring her to have sex in exchange for having her sewing machine fixed so that she can make her quota and keep her job. These women, we came together and said, what needs to change? And someone said, someone said, do you think that person needs to be fired? And they're like, immediately said, that's not going to change anything. They're just going to hire some other guy who's going to do this to us. That's not actually going to fix the problem. And by the way, I know him. He's from my community. And I think he's doing this because he thinks he's supposed to. So I actually think something needs to be done about providing support and education to him, right? To allow for the possibility that this person is doing this because of their role and the stereotypes and the pressure based on gender identity that he's experiencing. So, I think there's a lot there. And then again, not just focus on building a better mousetrap. That is not enough. In fact, what we would love, right, is that we don't have to use that process at all because we are focused on creating a safe, respectful environment where everyone understands their responsibility and how they benefit from working in a space that is free from these abuses.
Well, thank you. That's really helpful. And again, another really practical set of pieces of advice from Robin that are really right connected to the ethos and guidance of C190 and the recommendation that accompanied it. We have time for just one more question. I see there's several questions about how folks can learn more about the Lesotho agreement. And I would just point everyone who's interested to the Solidarity Center's website. If you go to solidaritycenter.org, and maybe someone can type that in the chat, you'll be able to look up Lesotho there, and you'll find a bunch of links that'll take you to press pieces and other organizations, and you'll learn all about the great labor movement of Lesotho and the women's organizations and their wonderful leadership on this issue. Just in 1 minute, which is really hard to do, we have a really excellent question about, culture change. The idea of getting to culture change in our societies, all of our male-dominated societies. Any advice on getting to culture change that'll allow for things like understanding the importance of this convention? And that could be for anyone who's got the gold on that. Yeah, Jane.
Absolutely key to ending gender-based violence. I mean, if we look at the conclusions in the book, this is all about changing cultures of power, of identity, of discrimination, of treating workers with respect. So, I mean, obviously we're talking here in the book about the workplace, but the workplace is impacted by the wider society. So the interconnections between work and society, family are all really, really essential in ending gender-based violence.
Oh, that's great. Kathy, quickly.
Yeah, I would just say that because I think what people are trying to ask is, where do I start with a campaign, right? And I think what we did to be successful is bring in folks that you may not think, right? The Consumer League in your country, organizations that have men and women in them that may see this as an issue that is really important, right? So I think the power of what we learned was this appeals to a broad sector. This is something that it is going to take a long time. You're dealing with structural change, but I do believe that an intersectional coalition, look beyond your usual coalition partners. And I think that is really important to addressing culture change.
Great. Well, thank you. Thank you.
Let me just add one thing,
Sure.
Shona, that I think involving our male counterparts in these campaigns and working together with them the way when they speak about culture change, their male counterparts hear them faster than we do when we are women. So I think it's also bringing them together in this campaign, giving them the space to talk about gender-based violence and harassment, and including sexual harassment, and that would also help into culture change.
Well, thank you so much to Rose, Kathy, Jane, and Robin for this amazing conversation. A reminder about the book, Stopping Gender-Based Violence and Harassment at Work, the campaign for an ILO convention, and they just dropped the chat again. Just want to turn it back to Lane.
Terrific. Thank you, Shauna. And thank you to all of our panelists for being here for this amazing conversation. I'm so happy that we ended talking about culture change and changing a culture of power. It's just a fabulous discussion. So thank you each for being here today. So we will send to all of our registrants a link to this recording. It's up now on the Kalmanovitz Initiative for Labor and the Working Poor's Facebook page, and we'll also have it up on our website page. Just a reminder that we hope that you'll stay involved. One way to do that is by joining us for our new social compact virtual convening June 2nd and 3rd. And there's a link there so you can find out more about that. And this, with that, this concludes our session today. Thank you all for joining us and have a great rest of your day. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.